A tyranny has been eliminated in Athens. In 510 BC, the family of Pisistratus has fled. To fill the power vacuum, Aristotle tells us there was a period of faction strife, or estasiazon, in Athens, in which Isagoras was pitted against Cleisthenes. Isagoras was a friend of the outgoing family of Pisistratus. Cleisthenes was a member of the Achaemenid family which had been most responsible for that removal. And each of these two men were supported by their own factions, but in the conflict between them, Cleisthenes comes off the worse. And it is this failure of Cleisthenes' faction to take Athens by its own power that prompts him to make a popular appeal, as Aristotle writes. He enlisted the people on his side, offering to hand over the government to the multitude. And the people will indeed triumph in this story. It is their own united initiative that prevails, because when Isagoras goes to receive the aid of the Spartan king Cleomenes, and the two of them take Athens and enter the Acropolis, it is the people who lay siege to it for 2 days until both men were forced to flee, and Cleisthenes is made head of the people. So in reflecting on these events, it's difficult to know what to visualize when Aristotle refers to faction strife. Was there violence in the streets? Was it more like a standoff with no violence and just a threat? Or was it a verbal argument? What I think happened is that the faction of Isagoras physically took control of the Acropolis, and that the faction of Cleisthenes did not have the manpower to take it back from him, and so he had to enlist the people. And we see the Acropolis changing hands a couple of times. Isagoras has it, then Cleisthenes has it, and then the Spartans show up to put Isagoras back. They take it, and then the people besiege it and take it back yet again. So it keeps changing hands. It's a confusing story. So now we're going to talk about what Cleisthenes did to alter the Athenian form of government. Aristotle writes, he divided the whole body into 10 tribes instead of the existing 4. So right there, we need to assess this line. When he says the existing 4, he's talking about the existing 4 tribes that Plutarch described to us in the life of Solon, when Solon divided the people into 4 groups according to their wealth. And the least propertied of these, I think they would have had no property, could not participate in the government as officers, only as jurors. So they were not particularly enfranchised, the 4th of these groups. But the other thing that must confuse us, and we have to think about, is that this was a class division under Solon. But as we can clearly see from the Aristotle, these distinctions that had previously been based on wealth are now over 50 years old. And there's been no new reassessment. And so it is clear that we have to make the inference that you were no longer a member of each class based on how rich you were, but based on whatever your father was. These are now better referred to as tribes, and that there's a hereditary quality to them, that the descendants of the original assessees could have any amount of wealth, which is to say that neither squandering nor making a fortune could change your status. And yet, as we're going to see in a moment, the people seem to have attached real quality to those old tribal wealth-based distinctions, because the higher you were on that hierarchy, the more political options you had. Cleisthenes wanted to change this, so in the new division from 4 tribes to 10 tribes, he had 2 goals. One is to fix the problem that the lowest class can't participate at all. And the second is to fix this hereditary, ridiculous obsession with the classes that the Athenians clearly have obtained. At least that's what's implied with the way Aristotle puts it, when he says that the purpose of the new division from Cleisthenes was wishing to mix them up in order that more might take part in the government, from which arose the saying, don't draw distinctions between the tribes. And of course, the best reason that more might take part in the government. New people were enfranchised. And so he made the council to consist of 500 members instead of 400, 50 from each tribe. And addressing further this issue of class obsession. Aristotle continues that it was a policy of Cleisthenes that they might not call attention to the newly enfranchised citizens by addressing people by the fathers' names, but designate people officially by their demes. So even having enfranchised the citizens, Cleisthenes felt like he also had to deal with a perception problem that prejudiced the Athenian citizens against those former members of the lowest class. Next, we do get some amount of land redistribution in Athens under Cleisthenes. Aristotle writes, he portioned out the land among the demes into 30 parts, 10 belonging to the suburbs, 10 to the coast, and 10 to the inland district. And he gave these parts the name of thirds and assigned them to the tribes by lot, 3 to each. And according to Herodotus, each of these tribes were given the names of local heroes that he discovered, as in Cleisthenes. So this is all very interesting. We've seen this elsewhere. Now I want to talk about this tribal division and this tribal land assignment. We have seen this in the book of Joshua, in the partition of the nation of Israel. And the Israelites divide the land into the 12 nations, each supposedly representative of the sons of Jacob. Now, that must have been pretty arbitrary. Just like here, we see the names of 10 local heroes. It seems ridiculous that the Hebrews could have remembered who was the descendant of who after all those years under Egyptian captivity. So after Moses led the Hebrews out of bondage and into the promised land, it was largely the work of Joshua to conquer the people who were already living there, right? God gave land, right? Milk and honey, but people were already living there, unfortunately, so they had to be conquered. But after they were, substantially, this is the Lord speaking in Joshua 13, 6 and 7. Only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance as I have commanded you. Now therefore divide this land for an inheritance to the 9 tribes. Sounds just like Cleisthenes. And there are many specific divisions written right into Scripture. Okay, Joshua chapter 15, the lot for the tribe of the people of Judah, according to their families, reached southward to the boundary of Edom. And then that continues. It's very tedious, this part of the book of Joshua, all these land descriptions. It reads like a registry of deeds. And the purpose of this, in both the instance of the Hebrews as well as the Athenians, returning to the reason behind this distribution and the intermingling, is to diminish the problem of faction. By a faction, James Madison writes in Federalist 10, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Madison also writes, the friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. The greatest threat to popular governments, according to James Madison, is faction. Madison still, so strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of faction has been the various and unequal distribution of property. That's Madison. The solution, according to him, is, just like as Cleisthenes would agree, extend the sphere and take in a greater variety of parties and interests. That's exactly, by the way, what the Hebrews did. Take this line, Genesis 49:5. I think this is God talking. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence, their swords. In their anger, they killed men, and at their whim, they hamstrung oxen. And the solution? 49:7. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. The solution to factionalism is to scatter its fiery elements. We see many instances as we move on of the Hellenic cities failing to band together in order to preserve their common interests, peace, and prosperity. Let's look at some of the examples of Greek disunity and their intertribal perfidy as we take some passages from Herodotus. Take this one episode. This is how ridiculous the Greek, this is what a problem factionalism is and disunity is. This is from around 545 BC. Herodotus begins this paragraph. This is how the Aeolians lost Smyrna. The people of Smyrna took in and sheltered some Ionian men who had been defeated in factional strife and exiled from Colophon, their home city. Once they were admitted into the city, the Colophonian exiles watched and waited until one day the people of Smyrna went outside the city walls to hold a festival in honor of Dionysus. Then the Colophonians shut and locked the gates and took possession of the city. This is what the Greeks have to deal with in being able to trust each other. You let in some refugees, and one day you're off drinking wine, celebrating to Dionysus, and they just lock you out, and they couldn't get it back. There's actually a really hilarious line. They settle for their movables being brought out to them. They walk up to the gates and negotiate with the Colophonians who've just taken their cities, shut them out. That's it. Nothing you can do about it. Please just give us our stuff. And that's what they did. You know, there's actually a Simpsons episode like this, where they let in a pair of carnies and the Simpsons get locked out of their house. Now, the Spartans have a similar problem with disunity. And this is coming back to actually the same age of what we're talking about. So now Cleisthenes finally realizes that he was duped by the oracle. Herodotus writes, Cleisthenes mustered an army from the entire Peloponnese without stating his purpose, but wishing to punish the Athenian people. With large army, Cleisthenes invaded Eleusis, and the Athenians deployed their troops against the Peloponnesians. But the Spartan army fell out. Herodotus writes, the Corinthians. So the Corinthians were apparently part of this coalition. After considering among themselves and concluding that they were becoming involved in unjust acts, were the first to do an about-face and leave. Next to leave was Demarados, the other king of the Spartans. Herodotus tells us this expedition had ingloriously fallen apart. The Greeks have unity issues. They're not good allies. Factionalism did them no favors. And reference to the outcome of the fall of Athens and the subjugation of all of Greece at a later date is a source of real dread in all of the writings of our founding fathers here in America. But let's still fit it. They still had their golden age, and that golden age is coming. And Herodotus philosophizes a little now. Thus grew the power of Athens, and it is proved, not by one, but by many instances, that equality is a good thing, seeing that while they were under despotic rulers, the Athenians were no better in war than any of their neighbors. Yet once they got quit of despots, they were far and away the first of all. This then shows that while they were oppressed, they willed to be cravens, as men working for a master. But when they were freed, each one was zealous to achieve for himself.